Today I plan to talk about how to survive and thrive in the post-COVID era. So most of you, I think, would agree that we're living in a very strange time. And I love this quote from Lenin: there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I think that's what we've all gone through. So for many of us, this is probably the biggest life-changing event that we've witnessed so far. And I know certainly when we look back on this, there's a good chance that we will consider this to have had the same amount of impact as a world war will have done on the world. But when we were forced to lock down and figure out how to work from home and socialize from home, to my mind, that was equivalent to experiencing something like the Industrial Revolution in a very compressed 2-week period of time there, where we suddenly had to adopt whole new ways of working and living. What I want to do here is give us a way of figuring out what we should be doing as SaaS companies. And I think in order to do that, we have to start by studying the disease itself. So I'm going to propose that we use this hierarchical framework where we start at the very top level and look at some of the important questions around the disease that are not answered yet. And then we can drop down into looking at the global impact, the macroeconomics impact, and then the impact on the tech industry. And lastly, we can talk about how this impacts a SaaS company and what you need to be doing as a SaaS company to survive and thrive. So looking at the epidemiology questions here, I really think there are two key questions. The first one is, when will we have a vaccine and when will that really be widely distributed and administered? Because without the vaccine, we will not be out of this crisis and we will still be having to do social distancing. And there is some good news. I think there's generally more optimism than there was in the past that we might have a vaccine proven out by the end of this year, but it still may take many, many more months or even years to get that widely distributed to people. I think the second big question here is, will we see a second wave emerge after we emerge from lockdown? And we're too early, I think, in the re-emergence to understand how that's going to play out. And a lot of it is due to how well can we do contact tracing and testing to be able to allow us to capture any new outbreaks and control them in a different way to what we did in the early stages here. But ideally, we do not go into another phase of lockdowns, as that would be further damage to the system. And the last question I think is worth pondering here is that this is not the first virus that's been like this. Can you imagine what life would be like if we had a future virus that comes along that has worse mortality characteristics and worse infection characteristics than the one that we've experienced now? And I think the world will actually enter a phase where pandemic handling is a very high priority going forward from this year. So what I take from this slide is the following. There are key unanswered questions that we have to factor into our planning. And that basically means that we have to plan for what we expect to happen, but then we need to have some plans in place for worst case scenarios that could emerge where things don't go as planned. And I think that's the important takeaway here. So if we look at the global impact, first I want to just give some credit to a good friend of mine, Nat Friedman, who came up with this format and some of the ideas on here. But I think we're seeing a world where we used to think of the office as the default place for work. I know many people are now rethinking that and considering that remote may be the better default place to do work from. And we would only come into the office to do things like community building, connection, meeting with customers, and potentially for maker spaces. So that's a significant change in how we work going forward from here. I think you've all been aware of the fact that so many things that we did in the physical world have had to move to the digital world. So the obvious ones are things like e-commerce, but there are many others as well. And so that's an acceleration of the digital transformation that's been going on for the last few years anyway, but it's been dramatically forced ahead than it was before. I'm hearing that a lot of people who move to cities to be closer to work will rethink that, given that they now have options with a remote work lifestyle and may move back to the countryside or suburbs where they can have a better quality of life due to more space. So that would be an interesting transformation as well. And one that I laugh at is that we used to think about how we appeared when we went into work, whereas what we now really care about is having a great microphone, great webcam, good lighting, and a decent background for our Zoom calls that we're doing. We were in a phase where there was a backlash against too much technology, and all of a sudden as we went into the lockdown, everybody discovered that without technology we would have been nowhere. So it was our lifeline to allow us to continue working and to continue socializing and staying in touch with our family and friends there. I think we're going to see a lot of problems coming from the fact that we went from full employment to very high unemployment. And I wrote this slide before the George Floyd protests emerged, commenting that I thought that we would see social unrest, and I'll comment more on that in a while as to why I think that's still a major issue for us going forward. We've just came out of a 10-year bull market where we saw all sectors positively impacted and rising. And we're now going into an era where there are extreme winners and also extreme losers, so a very different environment from that. And we're now entering an era of very high government debt, and I anticipate that we're going to have to see high taxation in order to be able to pay back some of the costs associated with supporting the unemployed during this time period and trying to keep businesses from going out of business. And we're seeing a change here from a very globalization-oriented way of thinking where you would source products from anywhere in the world, regardless of country, just simply to get the cheapest price. And we all realize that that led to some very insecure supply chains when an event like this happens. So I think we're going to see a move back towards nationalization and self-sufficiency. And you can look at other things like people were happy to pay $100,000 a year. I guess nobody was happy, but they were paying $100,000 a year for a college education. And if you're told that next year you're going to be doing that remotely, I don't think people would be willing to pay $100,000 for what's effectively feels like a webinar to them. So there are many other impacts like this, but those perhaps give you a quick sense of some of the ways that we need to be thinking about how the world is going to change around us. I also personally believe we're at the end of the old world order, and that world order started in 1945 after the Second World War, and it's been dominated by the US and the dollar as the global currency, and institutions that we've had around for ages like the United Nations, NATO, World Bank, and IMF that we kind of take for granted. The big disruption that's happening here is China's emerging as a major world power with increasing wealth and power over the US and playing by completely different rules to our own. We also are seeing some issues with capitalism around the wealth gap that's been created that should not have happened to create the great markets that capitalism depends on. And we've got these interruptions from outside sources like COVID and climate change that are disrupting things as well. So I think we're in an unstable state in the USA. The combination of high unemployment, this wealth gap that I mentioned, and this economic downturn, I think lead to a fight over how wealth gets redistributed. And given how divided the country is, I think that fight could be an ugly fight. No presentation these days would be complete without talking about the George Floyd protests. I think these signify a completely different level of recognition of the importance of trying to achieve racial equality. And I do want to point out that we're very supportive of the Black Lives Movement. And myself and the companies that I work with are all doing a lot of soul searching to see how we might more proactively contribute towards getting to racial equality. But I think there's a deeper message behind this. And if we look at the situation of America when these problems emerged, I think America was a tinderbox waiting to go up in flames due to the COVID unemployment and also this wealth inequality that's been building up for a while and racial inequality that's been around for a long while. That plus the fact that we're a very divided nation and with two sides farther apart than they have been in any time we can remember. So I think capitalism needs to evolve, and in particular it needs to figure out how to address the wealth gap. And then as a society we need to do far more to address racial inequality. And I personally believe that education equality is one of the most important things that we have to achieve. And we have to raise our educational standards because we've been dropping on the world stage. And if there's any early indicator of whether a country is dropping in its power on the world stage, education is the leading indicator for that. So I think the next few years are going to be pretty interesting and unstable as we navigate our way through these waters here. So let's drop down a level and talk about the macroeconomic impacts here. I think all of you know that the lockdown really seriously negatively impacted companies in the travel space, the hospitality space, the events space, commercial real estate, restaurants, doctors, colleges, and even states and cities are going to lose a lot of tax revenue from this. So there's a huge amount of our economy that's been directly impacted. And any of us who are not directly impacted with our businesses, I think will be indirectly impacted by that amount of the economy going through such a major hit there. And so if you look at the stock market recovery that would have you believe that everything is going great, if you look underneath the covers, you find that there are extreme winners and extreme losers, with the obvious losers being the airlines and large retail chains like Nordstrom and hotel chains like Marriott, and the winners being companies in the e-commerce space like Amazon, Shopify, and the cloud space. And the COVID lockdown winners are obvious: the video conferencing company Zoom, e-commerce, Amazon, Shopify, streaming media, Netflix, etc., gaming, remote collaboration, cloud computing, all winners here that have actually done very well as a result of the change that's happened. But trying to predict how serious this economic damage will be, I think we have to really look at the consumer here. And during this pandemic, 40 million people filed for unemployment benefits, which represents 1 in 4 workers being impacted by COVID. And right now, as of last Friday, we're down to 20 million continued unemployment claims, which represents about 13.3% of the economy. But the New York Times did a study to show that that's really undercounting things, and we really are actually affecting more like 27% of the workforce are impacted by unemployment. And if you think about that, that's 1 in 4 people, and that is going to have a huge impact. And in particular, consumer spending powers 70% of the US economy. So there's going to be a demand shock here that impacts things, and that will ripple through to every other business, even if they're not in the consumer space. And we see some supply chain disruptions. And I also believe one of the other damages that's going to happen is emerging countries will be more impacted by this and have less tools available for things like fiscal stimulus to fix the problems in their own countries. So that again will impact demand globally. On the positive side, the one thing that has worked really, really well here is the government stimulus package. And I think what we don't know at this point in time is how well will we be able to continue that if this endures, because it was great to be able to send checks for $1,200 to every unemployed person. But if this lasts for a year or more, can we still continue to afford to be able to do that? So I think everybody's seen these potential ideas for how the shape of the economy might emerge as we go through this. And I think most people believe or hope that we will see a U-shape, but the risk of the U-shape is that we get second wave infections, which could bring it to more like a W-shape. And yesterday, the OECD came out with some projections of what this will mean. And their headline quote here was that the world faces the worst downturn in a century. The global economy will contract 6% this year if there are no second waves, and 7.6% if there are second wave. The US economy will shrink by 7.3%. And the European economy will shrink by 9%. So that effectively projects the bottom of this U-shape. And I think what they're saying is that if we do come out of this, we will grow at about a 2.2% rate in 2021. So that gives you some idea of the shape of the U there. I also have some data that helps us understand this. This is from JP Morgan's credit card and debit card spending data. And the brown line, the one that I'm pointing at now, shows you all spending across every category, including e-commerce. And you can see that that dipped to a low of 35% below where it was last year, but having started at 10% higher, it's a 45% drop effectively. And it's recovered to 25% lower than where it was earlier on in the year. So still a significant way to go. But at least it shows that we've hit the bottom and we're on our way back to recovering. And if you're interested, the blue line here shows the credit card spending in industries like retail and physical retail and accommodation, restaurants, etc., where they were down 65% from the point where this started, and they're only back to about 35% there. Another chart that I find interesting here is what's happened with credit card spending on e-commerce. And these multiple different lines really represent different states in the United States, which are at different stages of the reopening. So we can ignore worrying about them, but the trend is what's worth looking at here. And the trend is that we were up something like 15% above where we were in credit card spending on e-commerce a year ago. And that has dramatically risen to around about the 55-60% level because of the lockdown. And the interesting question that I think is worth pondering here is, does this go downwards or does this really continue as an upward trend? Because everybody's beginning to discover more about how powerful e-commerce can be at helping them out. So let's drop down a level here and consider the impact that this has had on the tech world. Really, the headline here is that this has accelerated cloud adoption. And the reason why is that if you were a company that was using cloud and SaaS technologies when the lockdown happened, you were very well positioned to work from home. But if you were using on-premise technologies and had to use VPNs to connect to your systems, those were considered to be really clunky and very inconvenient and difficult to use. I spoke to several people on our team who were forced to work that way, and it was a horrific thing. They'd been resisting moving to the cloud, but they're not any longer. And obviously there was new technology needed to do things like video conferencing and remote collaboration that people previously hadn't been using. The second factor, though, was we saw a huge change in demand as we went into the lockdowns. And those companies who are using Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure were able to easily scale their capabilities up or down. So a company like Zoom, who saw a huge increase in demand for its products, could easily handle that because they were based in the cloud. Whereas if you think about a company that had its own data center, they would have had no flexibility to increase or decrease capacity. They were stuck with what they had. And I think people have realized in the corporate environment that this flexibility is absolutely essential. So even though we in our business always assume everybody's in the cloud, the stats from Microsoft and Google are that we're only about 10 to 15% migrated to the cloud. So they're still very early, and this has accelerated that transition there. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of move from physical things to digital things. So if you only have to look at signatures, moving to e-signatures and look at DocuSign's share price to see how rapidly that's caused that kind of a move to take place there. So this survey shows that 31% of the respondents plan to slightly increase their cloud migration plans over where they were planning last year. And this is in an environment where all other IT spending is going to get cut because of the recession that's coming up. So their original plans had an increase. Now they're going to slightly increase it, and 26% are going to significantly increase it. 8% will be slightly lower, and only 2% will be significantly lower than planned. And those are probably companies that are in the travel or hotel or entertainment spaces that have been heavily impacted here. So what this tells you is that the cloud is a massive beneficiary of the COVID wave taking place here. So this quote from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, also comments on the same thing that we're seeing here. We've seen 2 years' worth of digital transformation in 2 months. Here's a McKinsey quote. The luxury of time now seems to have disappeared completely. Businesses that once mapped digital strategy in 1 to 3 year phases must now scale their initiatives in a matter of days or weeks. And here's a ZDNet quote that I think is interesting as well. All along, digital transformation has been mainly seen amongst businesses under competitive threats such as tech-savvy industry disruptors. COVID-19 may be the mega event that pushes everyone towards digital transformation. So now we've studied those higher tiers, I think we can finally start to look at what does this mean for you as a SaaS company. And I think you already have probably bucketed yourself to have been either positively impacted or negatively impacted. And those are either in the neutral bucket. Your impact is most likely due to the recession that's going to come globally as a result of the lockdowns that were forced on us. So whenever there's a black swan event like COVID, there's really 3 phases of how it works. There's the first phase, which we've just gone through, which is where we experience the impact of the event. And then we're just starting to go into the recovery phase where we start to try to come out of that. But after that, there's a reinvention phase. And I think it's really important as entrepreneurs that we look forward and try to understand what that reinvention phase is going to look like and anticipate it, because it leads to great opportunity. So I've put a few ideas down here, but these are not by any means remotely close to complete for what's going to happen. But you can imagine that global supply chains moving to self-sufficient nations is going to create a lot of opportunity and change for how things get done. We already talked about how expensive colleges with no jobs after graduation is going to really likely lead to some new form of higher education that has a far more cost-effective way of working. You could imagine that instead of doing vacations by going on holiday in person, we will actually do those with virtual reality by donning a VR headset from our living room. And I could see a situation where you might be able to log in and control a drone that walks around the Louvre looking at pictures that you're interested in under your control. Or even more interesting is to take over control of an aerial drone that has some constraints on it to stop you from crashing it or doing dangerous things, but that might allow you to do things like going around the Acropolis in Greece or seeing some of the other fascinating world sites that you would want to travel to that we couldn't do today. So that would be another reinvention, effectively, of how we do travel and tourism. And of course, all forms of work are now going through a change, because if we are moving towards remote work, we have so many different things that we need to learn how to do. Like, how do we manage when we used to do that face-to-face? We used to observe performance, now we're going to have to measure performance. How do we do recruiting when that was done typically in person? You got so many signals from an in-person meeting. How do you do onboarding, which is so hard to think of doing that remotely to get somebody really familiar with a company? And I think at the end of all of this, it's probably worth remarking that we often believe that we've hit the end of the computing platform changes, but I personally believe that desktop screens and smartphones are by no means the end of the platform changes. And the next platform change that we will see will be a shift to using AR glasses that have a fiber optic painting system that paints an image on the back of your retina, such as we've seen from Magic Leap. And those, together with technology like we have from a company that we had backed called Control Labs, which puts cuffs on your wrists. And if you then type for 10 minutes on a keyboard, those cuffs read the signals being sent from your brain to your hands. And you can then take the keyboard away and continue typing, and it will still continue to produce the characters that you would have had if the keyboard was there. So that kind of brilliant technology allows you to act as the input mechanism when you have those AR glasses on. And I think what comes after that is we will have chips embedded in our brains, and many of you will react very negatively to that, but I'm personally one of the people who's willing to take that risk to see what this does. But it will help expand our memories and our computational abilities. But what gets really interesting is when you think about that in a networked environment. So I could be sitting about to catch a huge wave in Hawaii, and over the network, I could transmit all of my sensations and visual experiences to you in a sofa, and you could be 6,000 miles away from where I am. So we still have a lot of reinvention and transformation that's going to take place, which creates great opportunities for entrepreneurs here. So what should you be thinking about doing? Well, I think one of the first steps is to check your product market fit. You built for a world that was before COVID. COVID is changing the world, particularly for your customers. Have your customers' problems and their priorities changed? And what should you be doing about that? Are there new opportunities that you can take advantage of here and adjust your strategy where appropriate? And I'm sure all of you have done this if you're in a SaaS business. You've looked at checking the customer health that you have and evaluated the risk in different categories. So each industry that you sell to has a different level of risk. And if the company's small and doesn't have a lot of cash, that's also a different level of risk. So you probably wanted to bucket these customers by these different buckets here as to which levels of risk you had and score them using COVID as a new factor on top of your old churn factors that you would think about. And then maybe refocus on the healthiest segments in your industry that you can go after. And I talked to HubSpot about how they were doing this, and they told me they had this bucket system of putting people into failing, surviving, adapting, and growing, and used that as one of their risk categorization techniques. But everybody is very clear that it is very important to try to retain customers at all costs. The last thing you want to do is lose a customer and then find that when things bounce back, that they went to a competitor because you didn't look after them. So I think you want to be very proactive, particularly with your larger customers, and reach out to them. And then everybody's been telling me that they've been pushing to give concessions to customers. So oftentimes you might delay payments or let the customer choose when they're going to make payments. Sometimes people have given short-term discounts or long-term discounts to make it easier for the customers. But I do think one of the most important things here is to show empathy to your customers and really show that you're willing to help them survive and get through this particular transition as being on their side as opposed to trying to maximize your opportunity. So I also think you may want to look at how you go to market, because there are certain ways this will be changed. So face-to-face selling, for example, is no longer a good option. And large deals are definitely always impacted by a recession. It's harder to get those approved. So if you're using enterprise selling techniques, you may want to consider doing something like a product-led growth strategy or new lower-priced entry point packages so that people can get into your product and working with you. And there's an interesting thing here about, can you help your customers by identifying what their opportunities are to change and reinvent their businesses around COVID, and what pain points they have that are new, and maybe help with their strategy and responses to that. Plus also, I know a lot of your customers will be working from home, and they may need your help to do that better. And also many of your customers will have made furloughs and layoffs, and you may see a need to retrain new users on your product and have higher support levels. And you may also lose your champion, and that's one of the greatest indicators of future churn. So you may need to make sure you've actually got new executive sponsors lined up behind you. So one example of one of my portfolio companies is a company called Namely that does HR, payroll, and benefits. And their customers are mostly small to medium-sized businesses between 50 and 2,000 employees. And all of them, when the Payroll Protection Program, PPP loans, were announced, wanted to very rapidly figure out how much they were eligible to apply for and what amount would also be possible to get forgiven under the loan terms. And that meant looking at the payroll over the last 12 months, and Namely introduced a new feature very quickly to allow them to get that data that allowed them to make those applications, as well as some new features to help them with the compliance that they now had around different laws that were coming out and compliance with things like reopening. And the result of that was that their speed of response got them an immediate increase in net promoter score because they were shown that they were a far more responsive company than some of their competitors like ADP. I know all of you are also dealing with the challenges of how to work remotely, and that's putting stresses on different functions like being able to do recruiting in person, onboarding, difficult thing to do in person, and also trying to maintain your culture in an environment where you don't see people face to face. That's significantly tricky. So there's clearly a need for very strong leadership in this environment. One of the other things that's changed in this world is funding, and I think this quote from Scale Ventures nicely summarizes the new thinking. The big change in my criteria for new investments is that a company must be able to continue growing in the current environment. We don't know how long this downturn will last, so I don't buy into the promise of as soon as the economy recovers, growth will resume. So what that tells me is that if COVID has impacted your growth, you probably will find it harder to get financing and valuations will drop. So I think we're going to see an environment with some winners and losers here. Some underperforming startups will likely get weeded out, which actually creates great acquisition opportunities for some of the stronger players that are out there. So how do we behave in this world? Well, to survive, cash is absolutely king. And you're going to want to make sure, if you can, that you have 18 months of cash on hand, or if you don't have that, to find a way to figure out how you're going to get to your next financing milestone for a successful fundraise. And I'll talk in a short while about what it means to get to a successful milestone for that fundraising. Given that this environment has so many unanswered questions, it could go in multiple different directions, and we don't yet have enough data and answers to really understand that. So to my mind, that means that we need multiple plans. We need a business plan for what we think will happen, but we need also to have a worst case plan for when things may turn out to be worse than we expect. Particularly the recession that we're facing may turn out to be deeper than many of us are hoping for. And I think many of you have been forced to revisit your organization design and have had to make cuts in order to try to figure out ways to survive and keep your cash to last through this whole period of time here. So let me move on to talking about those milestones that I mentioned earlier on. I think all of you know that startup valuations don't simply increase linearly as a matter of time since your last fundraise, that they're really dependent on you hitting certain significant milestones. And those milestones are really all about reducing risk or de-risking things, proving that you've de-risked certain things in your business plan. And here are a couple of the questions that matter. Does your product actually work? Is somebody willing to pay for it? Are multiple people willing to pay for it? And on this chart, I've shown you all of the key steps that I believe you need to get to a repeatable, scalable, and profitable growth machine. And particularly one of the hardest steps is figuring out, can non-founders sell your product? And can you then scale your growth processes once you've got a repeatable process? Can you keep the scaling without inducing excessive churn as you scale? And then can you be profitable as you're scaling as well? So does your LTV exceed your CAC? So as I was going through these milestones for financing, I realized something else happened at these different inflection points, that they really represented a complete change in how you needed to run the business at these different stages here. And so I came up with a model, and I've been told that this is one of the most valuable pieces of content that I've produced. It's a 9-step model for how you get to a repeatable, scalable, and profitable growth process. And it, in particular, some of the important lessons to learn from this is that it's very crucial not to skip ahead or try to skip steps by jumping ahead, because you simply find that you cannot skip ahead and you have to go back and repeat those steps, and you burn a lot of cash in the process there. So this is one of the most valuable pieces of content that I would recommend that if you're interested in following up from this talk, that you investigate. And I'll put a link to it in the description down below. I also recommend that you find it on my website here in this article called Matrix Growth Academy 0 to 100 Videos, where all this material is broken down into short 10-minute video clips. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been valuable for you, and I look forward to the time when we can all get together face to face again.